I'm Jeffrey O'Brien, a poet in the English department, and I co-run the Holloway series with Jane Gregory over there, and I want to thank Jane for her work all semester doing the invisible things that make these events happen. So thank you, Jane. I'm really, really glad to have Frank Wilderson here for two reasons. One, because he's Frank Wilderson, and the second reason is because it's been a strange and abbreviated Holloway semester. We, in solidarity with AFSCME, observed the speakers boycott in the middle of the semester and had 2 of our 4 events canceled. And so we were in a lot of sad suspense of the political excitement about whether or not Frank was going to get to come. So we're really glad that that ended positively. We had a lot of good things happening for those workers and that Frank could be here. Here he is. So without any further ado, let's just get into tonight's event. First, we will hear from Mary Wilson, a grad student in the English department and poet, and Ishmael Muhammad will introduce Mary, and then Joshua Anderson will come up and introduce Frank Wilderson, and then we will hear from Frank. And if there's time afterwards, Frank has graciously agreed to do a little Q&A, so if we do have time, we can do that. Will you be okay with moderating that yourself from the podium?
Sure.
Okay, so hopefully we can have that as well. And thank you very much for being here. Let's get started.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to introduce Mary Wilson. I've known Mary for 4 years now. She's my friend and colleague here in the English department, in addition to being my housemate over in Oakland. In both her critical work and poetry, Mary is interested in the idea of the city and the social practices to which it gives rise. Her treatment of urban environments recalls de Chautel's image of the city as a text written out of its citizens' movements. Accordingly, Mary's poems track the ways we move through, live in, and give shape to urban environments, which is to say that it tracks movements too often lost to official accounts of the city. Her poetry reads as a map to an alternative geography wherein psychological landscapes meld with physical ones, and something as impersonal as concrete becomes a site for sensation. In the poems we'll hear tonight, likable humans take on the dimensions of cityscapes. Bright ones alternate like street lamps, and material surroundings become written. Please welcome Mary Wilson.
Thanks, Ishmael. Thank you, Jane and Cecil and Gregory Jeffrey, for organizing this reading. It's a huge honor to be here. I'm going to read just a few short poems and then a few excerpts from a longer series, which is titled either In This Housing or Nothing New and Again, neither of which titles I completely like, so we'll see what it ends up being. First one is called My Geography. Can you hear me okay? My Geography. I'm getting older. Teenagers on city buses make me feel deep joy. 1 brings things up, and 2 makes syllables arrive like Emily Dickinson. So their friendship is beautiful and well-timed, a noun that turns to face the plural of bus stops. This morning, I was so full of poems in the shower that I couldn't write anything down. I like to imagine a lineage between showers, Emily Dickinson, and the exaltation of public transit. I've nicknamed the teenagers Coke and Pepsi because one wears a Coca-Cola t-shirt, but the other one could just as well be Moxie, King Cola, or my hometown favorite, Polar Beverages. According to Wikipedia, Polar sparked a lawsuit with Coca-Cola in 1994 after running a commercial where a thirsty polar bear tosses a Coke can into a garbage pail that reads, "Keep the Arctic pure," and proceeds to pound a polar beverage to his great satisfaction. Coke felt this chain of events implied their product was somehow impure, which it did. They won the lawsuit, and that year the great inflatable polar bear that perched on the horizon of my city like a beacon shrank a little. I always tell my students not to cite Wikipedia, but sitting as I do at this distance from Massachusetts, the Arctic, and the love of sugary beverages, I can say with some authority that these things happen as they're written. Likeable humans. A likeable human is small, honest, and crowded. She has generous lace. Her specs today, when someone wheeled them over, listed her companion stats at 3 rocks to a show, which is 3 rocks more than a room full of people who think about each other daily while eating kale for a period of 6 weeks. People are worth dying for. Under the light of lamp-bright humans, alternating from the street dark, which is life choosing her prey, into the spotlight of our sympathy. Didn't you see how the show glowed the room over their combined attention? Didn't you say it was the radial against the wheel? The usual he. The usual he values my documentary. How lopsided it nouns, tenacious, city woods. In a book, he tells me, bring me back a file, something to eat, vital child, little pill. Where your father and weather went is where my infant tongue could tell the barn is photographed from the red car exterior. I'm finding education in tall buildings. I've been reading a parentheses of dates, an italics of songs, so the bones you have broken may ladder up, and we, who have always thought of happiness, climbing, may be startled into new conceptions of the geographic mood. I'm getting work done, one disorder at a time, banishing myself who did not work. A street name lingers on the meadow of the internet in spring, but this is personal. Like Robert Motherwell defeats the Mercator projection map in the secret ekphrasis of my memory. And this is in this housing. Consider the material surroundings as written. The winding streets, the long towers covered in leaves, the clowns that circle the piazza at noon. A city, the right city, will help you to locate yourself in the moment of a longed-for departure, a getaway. In its singular form, the word opens caverns behind its characters, distracting but for the bats winging across a side street, the deer grazing in the yards of the rich, the cars alone at right angles. All these are language enough for a few time zones. In summer we will cross the earth. All things are full of labor and beyond description. Nothing is new that honks beneath the rented sun, not even this image of the sun being hourly. Close your eyes. If you do it hard enough, you can evacuate all causes from your body. Cause of death, cause of a room, cause of sleep that comes when you're not looking for it. I could have missed you as a canister misses a jar that misses its contents. Your illness was such a proliferation of insides. Necessity says stop the noise and don't listen after it. Sleep inside the city of assumed living, kill the oxygen machine, and come to bed. When awake, I have a boundary. I try to make some noise that will be permanent. In this way, I alter what is seen. My neighbor's reflection shrinks in the window of her living room, back and back until her yard is empty. I thought her shirt was smoke above her head. Will we eventually owe each other all the time we spent together? The goats bleating in the yards of neighbors, the cis couples on television. Her problem was that she had no buffer for domestic labor in all its returns, which is a pit he put her in between himself. She had to change all the locks, got home late from the party of antonyms, and rose, her bathrobe hardening through days of his absence. She's looking out the window again. She thinks, a man mows his public living room on Sunday, but only walks across it in times of distress. If everyone agrees this city is a video, then the infrastructure holds us through the next shining thing. We could sing about it essayistically, the way Abraham Lincoln looks down at those long-haired rockers from his high chair in the video, and they look back at him like, what is your symbolic register here? Lifestyle cues are important in poetry. Run to the lives for your hills is one karaoke mishap this valley knows. And being from a mid-sized city, population juggalo, with more pharmacies than pizza, more Windex than Old Milltown, I can see how our demand outgrows the use of us. How it blows in with the patents from the metropole, the medical, the ramp before the housing, and then from under our feet, the pavement. In this model, history is left out with the toothpicks and the petroleum rounds, out on its ass in the pavement of bad zip codes. There is no model. Summers of ineffectual trickle down, the teenager goes down, buys Camels from the liquor store, and pauses by the middle-class sprinkler system, counting her change. There's a moment of paralysis. We are leaving. We are not leaving. Our own leaving is behind us, facing us, flaunting its purchases. I'm just going to read one more short poem. This is called The Contract. Space gets bought and sold. Like watching nativity scenes, to understand first knowledge of domestic animals, the birthplace reveals itself. Tieback in the cradle, the non-woven stuff of airtight being restless under a sky like this. If you believe in the terminal block of language, it will find you naming something it doesn't contain. A glass of water, a lover, a condo, a well-appointed shelf. One breath lets loose a billion particulates of how we relate to each other, especially on cold days when our breath can see itself a share in communal airspace. Don't go out naming what isn't there. Or do, but only if the name is at your door. Or don't, but only if you know exactly where you are. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Josh Wilderson. I'm a graduate student here in the English department, and it is an honor and a pleasure to be here tonight, listening to Mary and getting ready to hear Frank read. I was trying to think of a word for to be excited. It's like pleasure and honor. So I guess it's an exciture or something like this. There's probably one out there. As you all probably know, Frank B. Wilderson III is an alumnus of UC Berkeley and is currently the professor of African American Studies and Drama at the University of California, Irvine. Theorist, critic, dramatist, filmmaker, and poet. Among a list of other writings, he is the author of 2 books, Incognegro, a memoir of exile and apartheid, published in 2008, which won the American Book Award in that year, and Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms, published in 2010. The force of his theoretical work, widely known as Afro-pessimism, comes from the lucidity with which it reorients a whole host of popular assumptions concerning blackness by positing its condition, its relation to humanity, as one of ontological death. That is to say, it rearticulates the stakes that are themselves the problematics of the question of oppression/liberation by shifting the crux of that binary from an articulation of conflict, a concept that connotes the prospect of reconciliation, to a relation of antagonism, which is, by its very nature, one of irreconcilable encounter. This move alone realigns the terms by which the problems of anti-blackness now demand to be understood. Afro-pessimism puts pressure on the very structure of our way of thinking about racism, violence, colonialism, intersectionality, and more, much more. The ineluctable conclusion of Afro-pessimism's claim that the nature of blackness as a relation in and to the world is one of social death is that because it is ontological, it cannot be resolved. What Afro-pessimism wants to point out is that when academic discourse is talking about fixing things, helping people, liberation, isn't what we think, that's not what we think we're talking about. The task of looking for a way out of this mess becomes infinitely more difficult or even inarticulable for a great many of us. Somewhere in here, we have got to talk about the destruction of the world. It's easy now, I think, to see where the pessimism comes from, and also why I assumed that Professor Wilderson's poetry would be nothing short of apocalyptic. But it isn't. It's about life. And this in a manner that is actually coextensive with the project of Afro-pessimism. It isn't a life that stands relationally opposed to death, but a life which rests, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but exists paradoxically and impossibly impossible by its nature within it. If the work of Afro-pessimism involves performing a work of understanding as opposed to liberation, if it's to delineate a relation as opposed to focusing on a cultural object, if Professor Wilderson's project involves providing a space for us to talk about the impossibility of black life, if the theory is the emphasis on impossibility, then the poetry is the emphasis on life. But this binary similarly rejects its seemingly inherent hyperbolism. Life in Professor Wilderson's poetry doesn't mount to an equally forceful counteroffensive, does not strive to overcome through affirmation, doesn't seek balance. If the brilliance of Afro-pessimism is the way in which it uncovers the everyday relations of life in the world by deploying hyperbolic terminologies, if it succeeds in rendering registrable that which was previously unapprehended, his poetry seeks to flesh out this newly apprehended world. In a mode reminiscent at times of the late Mahmoud Darwish, subtle symbolisms or the suggestion of symbolisms bubble to the surface here and there, and in doing so sketch the relations between things and subjects in the world. Street lights and other lamps are significant in that they light. They provide the set of conditions for apprehending the world, secretly calling you to register that they are there and that that's what they do. A myriad fruits and flowers exist in a durational relationship with the lyrical voice. This is how you know where you are, and this is what you see when you're there. The structures of lines, sentences, or phrases piece together grammars and logics that make sense insofar as they couldn't possibly have been immediately registerable as such, but are knowable only through a dreamlike process whereby sense is made known through this very display of itself as both not obvious and frighteningly true. But this dream is of the world. It is in the world. It has stakes, consequences, weight, and malleability. It is lived, and it is here that the space is created for the work of understanding. So I'll hope you will please join me in welcoming Professor Frank B. Wilderson.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I haven't had anyone speak of my poetry that clearly educating me on it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'd like to begin. Am I being heard in the back also? Okay. I'd like to begin by thanking Jeffrey O'Brien and Jane Gregory for putting this series together and for inviting me here tonight. I'd also like to thank my wife, Anita Wilkins, who's a consummate poet in her own right and whose work over the years has really helped me intellectually as well as creatively in thinking about how to think through poetry and critical theory together. But her own work has been pedagogic to me in the sense that I've learned something about how to use and deploy images, line breaks, and when to give up words that I am wholly invested in and do not want to give up because they might not be good for the reader or the listener, even if they're absolutely wonderful to me. So this is I'll read a few poems from a chapbook that I put together, and looking for a home now and then. It's called Sideways Between, the chapbook's called Sideways Between Stories. And part of the reason for that is that I started writing poetry in 3rd grade. And the center set of poems that I'll read are from my life in an all-white neighborhood in Kenwood, which I write about in Incognito. But we had a little, Anita and I had a little discussion, and I kind of, she said that you should read some of those poems from 3rd grade. And I thought, no, I can't possibly do that. I reread them to myself, and it reminded me of something that an editor said to me when I was about 19 years old and heavily influenced by Dada and Surrealism, and thought that if there weren't like 10 metaphors per sentence, it just wasn't working. And she sent the manuscript back to me and she said, "You're a really great writer, but I'm not going to publish this because I don't want you to be embarrassed 40 years out." So that's how I feel about the, even the poem that Anita wanted me to read, which won some public school Minnesota poetry prize in 64, 65. I said, nah. She said, it's good. And I remembered a secretary at a place where I worked who said their wives will tell them anything. But thank you for that. Okay, so I've kind of divided this into 4 sections. I'll read about 2 poems from each section. Section 1 is called Abroad, and it has to do with resonance with some of the time I spent in South Africa. Section 2 is called Love, and the 3rd section is Home, and the 4th one is Death, or People Without Personhood. This first poem that I'll read, and if my voice goes down, could you give me the high sign in the back? I'd appreciate that. This first poem is called Nord Street, and it's in the late 80s and 90s. I was in South Africa, and many of you know the situation in South Africa. This is Berkeley. A lot of people listen to KPFA, and people have been there, and the Global Exchange are on their own. So other places in the world, I have to start giving the whole background, but I won't give everything. Basically, how can I situate this poem? After the assassination of Chris Hani, who was the commander of the armed wing, Contra Wesizwe, and was also the Secretary General of the Communist Party, and by incidentally, he was also a member of the National Executive of the ANC, and he actually had, there are 100 people who were elected to the National Executive of the ANC, and what people tend not to know, because only delegates and some regional representatives actually saw the vote, but Hani had 2,000 votes out of 2,000 delegates, whereas Nelson Mandela, to get on the National Executive, had 1,995. So he was infinitely not powerful, but popular, especially amongst the lumpen and what they call unskilled workers in South Africa. Once he was assassinated in 1993, people started scurrying for parents, political parents inside the ANC. And what we found was that there was a long purge, this is not a lecture on South Africa, but this purge of about 100,000 out of 350,000 people in the ANC, card-carrying members. And there was a place called Shell House in Johannesburg, and Shell House was near a train station called Nord Street Station. And Nord Street Station when I arrived, it was just, the Group Areas Act was just being abolished, and so there was remnants of the white and colored and black entrance, but that was going away. But what was coming in was the creeping neoliberalism, the sellout that the ANC would initiate by the time we got to vote. At the bottom of Shell House and outside Nord Street Station was an informal market where people sold fruit and parts for cars and different types of things. And I became friends with a woman whose niece actually was a student in Soweto at a college that I taught called Vista University. So this is a poem which echoes my disappointment and I think the feeling that a lot of people had as we started to move towards a vote, and it became clear that what we were going to have was not a socialist revolution which redistributed wealth, but what Chris Hani called a flag and anthem nation. It's called North Street. Between the ashes of apartheid and what they say is coming are the merchant stalls at North Street Station, where a woman sells bruised fruit. Above the rock and tumble of trains, her feet hold down the earth. Her hands move over late mangoes and pears, turning each imperfection inward against the eye. It is July in Johannesburg, winter, where from lampposts politicians wait for the wet oblivion of night. In the last seeds of daylight, I fill my bag with apple, guava, attempt nonchalance with a track of stitching under her eye, and say, as always, keep the change. This is not my country. For years I marked my calendar by 2 seasons. Rain, when jacaranda petals bleed their purple into the soil, and not rain, when waiting for the season of rain. Now it's marked by days of abstinence from this face of scars, a spectacle for my optimism. For though I am aging, the face in my passport still lays claim to me upon demand and shares my unclipped skin. As dusk and the first lampposts flicker and choke like promises, I wonder which locomotive en route to which desert turned its steel into her cheek, and tell her how I loved the last fruit spoiled on my kitchen table. The next poem is called The Lucky Ones with Their Shadows. And this is a poem that I originally dedicated to Tefu Kiliboni and Heinrich Balke. And at the time that I wrote the memoir, I changed their names. Tefu's name became Jabu, and Heinrich's name became Trevor. They were students, undergraduate students at the University of Witwatersrand. And Heinrich was directly my student. He was working on, in the British system, they have this thing called honors between the BA and masters. But both these young men were part of a unit of Mkonto Wesizwe, which means Spear of the Nation, which was the armed wing of the ANC. And Tefu Kiliboni's first cousin, named Bushy, who's dead now actually, was the commander of the West Rand. I can't really translate. Let's say that Rand is kind of like county. So I was recruited into this unit under them. And what happened was but I also had another life, which was above ground structures. I was, I won't give a litany of all that, but one of the things I did was to become what's called a sub-regional political commissar for the Gauteng region, sub-region, which is basically the city of Johannesburg and the 16 townships that touch it, Soweto being the largest. So it would be like if the Democratic Party, well, that's not like the Democratic Party at all, but so it's bad analogy, but let's just go with it so we get to the poem. It would be like a 5-person political committee that ran the political organization for Alameda County. That's kind of like what I did above ground. But anyway, in this particular, I was really working up under these 2 guys in this clandestine structure. And what happened was that on really, wow, this is the time. It was April 10th, 1993, when Chris Hani was assassinated. And what Hani had done, interestingly enough, is he had worked with a group of people, Heinrich was one of them, who said that, if they, because what was happening, there were a lot of assassinations, attempts, and the murder of what we call mid-level political commissars. These are people who would be like state political, like California state political representatives, that kind of thing, in the ANC. And de Klerk was very smart, unlike both of before. He wasn't assassinating national executive members because that would get the ire of the West. Well, so Hani was the national executive member who was actually assassinated. And what Hani had said was that he was going to allow Mandela to call for suspension of the armed struggle unilaterally. I mean, he didn't really allow it. Mandela did that on his own. In the interest of unity, he wasn't going to go against that. But he also said, for every 3 AK-47s that you bury, keep one hidden from Mandela's people, okay? And that if they start to assassinate people in the national executive, then these are certain targets that need to be hit in retaliation. Well, I think Mandela knew about that. When Hani was assassinated, he called in rapid fire all kinds of structural leaders to say, look, if you do anything now to help get this revolution going, you will not have a job or a place in the party once we come to power. So Heinrich and Tefru and Bushi and a few other people were the only people to follow through on what Hani had planned should this happen. And they went to, and they bombed the Conservative Party headquarters. The Conservative Party had orchestrated the assassination of Hani. Well, Mandela made another move to say that should there be a popular uprising in support of or catalyzed by this, then above ground leaders would not have any jobs either. And it became necessary, and I was not really in on this decision, of course not, I was a grunt. But I think that what Bushi Kiliboni decided was that it was necessary for people who had been secretively operating to come above ground so that they could actually argue inside the ANC for a revolutionary discourse. And the only way to do that was to get credentials very, very quickly. And what had to happen was that Heinrich and Tefru went back to the scene and they threw their identity documents into the scene and then waited in their dorm rooms to be arrested and then tortured over 6 weeks so that they could emerge as new, not secret, but new above-ground politicos. In that period, there was something interesting that happened was that Heinrich was tortured in a particular way in which he was tortured as a contemporary of the torturers. And Tefru was tortured as a thing, as someone who didn't have a mother or a father. I mean, one of the things that they kept saying to Heinrich was, your father's dying, or what are your parents going to think of you, or you're not being a good Afrikaner boy, that kind of thing. And when I listened to them tell their story afterwards, it became clear to me that none of the tortures related to Tefru as a subject in any way at all. So at the end of this poem, it says something about people who are not, it says that people who are not tortured, their safe return is ensured by those who are. But I also want to say that internal to that is that Heinrich's safe return, in other words, the quality, if that can be a word, of how he was tortured was vouchsafed by the fact that he could be thought of as a subject of abuse, where Tefru could only be thought of as an object of abuse. This is called the lucky ones with their shadows. Sometimes in a country where torture is rife, I think how lucky the school children whose denial is truly plausible, whose sleep is dependent on screams of what they may not become, a nostril punctured by a favorite math pencil, a vulva pinched with shock tools from the floor of 7th grade, testes crushed by new tissues. Part pupils, part objects of pain in rooms darkened with sunlight where they alone are the only students. Spongy knowledge free of texts, the lucky ones, they may never know this fraternity of fragments, these dim and flickering lamps at night, truant to the streets, ensuring their future, their safe return. So, this section is called Love. And I tell my grad students, if you go and you read any of my work, and my rough drafts, and you see any form of affirmation in it, please tell me so I can take it out. They don't laugh. But this is to my wife, Anita, and it's called The Names We Go By. We were kind of discussing how this poem came about, and had, anyway, we were at a writer's colony in Blue Mountain, and to the best of my knowledge, someone was asking about her life in 1940s in Montana and Wyoming. And somehow at the table of writers and artists, someone said, so what do they call you, Anita or Dolores? And she said, neither. Dolores is her middle name. And she said, they call me sister. So I got to ribbing her about that, like, they can't, your name's too difficult, your family can't take it. And then there was a more discussion about that in terms of how her brother was, and now I'm going to mess it up here, how her brother, the way I heard the conversation was that her brother was always thought of as the good one. And so that was what was in my mind when I actually wrote the poem. Last night we were talking about it, and she was like, no, my brother always thought he was the good one. It wasn't that anyone thought he was. So where the truth is, I don't know, but there's poetic license here, we'll see. Okay. It's called The Names We Go By, for Anita. In a time too poor for names, uncles, aunts, your parents, and a brother more angelic than the stars called you sister. I see that pass before me as night, always night with flocks of sheep bundling a sky of red dust and ruin. You are there in the deep incomprehension of your kin, beyond broadcasts of depression or war, knowing how the tails of comets to be seen must not be looked upon. From my coast I practice cartography. I trace your voice for trees twisted by wind. I listen to your eyes for a reason. I grope back the way I came through other loves, for a place pulled away by sand and sea, the place our hearts went down for air. Sister, I am here, amid the useless prayers, the names we go by. I studied psychoanalysis right next door in Dwinell, in the rhetoric department. And something struck me in one of the classes about the imaginary. This will not be a lecture on psychoanalysis. But Professor Kaiser-Silverman was saying that there's a way in which the imaginary works in the psyche when you fall in love, and it works exactly the opposite when you fall out of love. So that there's nothing bad about the person when you fall in love. There's nothing good about them, when you're filing for divorce. And I was thinking about my divorce. To my first wife, Kamohilo, and it didn't seem quite to work like that, And then one of Anita's friends said something about her divorce, and she said, we came to a point where one person wasn't bad and the other person wasn't good, but the paths on which we were traveling and where we were going were more divergent than convergent. And so there wasn't this kind of necessity for the absolutism of a condemnation at the end of it. And I thought that that was really a better scenario for what I was feeling at the end of my marriage with Kamahelo. And again, I won't say more about this because, you know, I start to say something about my life to someone, and as though I'm giving them information, they go, yeah, I know, I read your memoir. You know, and so that becomes like, as though I have nothing new in my life to say, okay. This is called The Politics of Everyday Fear, and I was reading Masumi on Deleuze, and that was the title of his book, and I didn't have another title, but it seemed to work very well here. The Politics of Everyday Fear, for Kamahelo. Since we've parted, I've become one of those people who sat never more than once a childhood at our dining room table. Before life, excuse me, let me start again because I think I missed one. Since we've parted, I've become one of those people who sat never more than once a childhood at our dining room table. The day after, or perhaps 2 days before, a life in some far-off and unpronounced place I could not imagine. Over broccoli, roast beef, and early bedtime. They were all 10 years younger or 10 years wiser than their age. They lived sideways between stories. They laughed the loudest, talked the most, ate the least, and drank well past the hour of civilized departure, as though they who lived everywhere had nowhere to go, and would sleep on our doorstep to not be turned out into the world. In the 70s, early 70s, my uncle was in military intelligence, and he had been to Vietnam, and he was dead set on the idea that I was going to go into the military service also. So my dad was a professor, and not that my dad shares my rabid anti-Americanism, but he certainly was not a hawk. And so he said, we were all talking, and so my uncle was, you know, wanted to plan my future. I can't say exactly, but I was between 12 and 13 and 14. And so he was telling my dad about all the kind of academies that he could get me into, and as they were talking, I just opened Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. And I began reading to them, you know, at the dining room table, you know. And and I said, you know, the average American, it says here, wakes up wondering whether or not they're going to have ham or eggs with their scrambled bacon. The average Vietnamese wakes up whether or not they're going to be napalmed or the village will be burned down. I'm not joining any damn army. So my poor dad, you know, his brother looked over at him and he said, "This is your doing." So I've since grown into my compassion for both of them, and what I remember was the Tet Offensive of 1968, and even though, you know, my parents, their emotional investments were on the wrong side, and my uncle's activist investments were on the wrong side, it was really tense as to whether or not he was going to make it out and come back to his wife and children. So many years later, I wrote this poem, Tet, from his, I guess, the vision of his wife. Tet. In a gray veil of drizzle, she clears a space where tombstone tongues lick wet leaves, lays the wire and cloth poppies survivor's cell. The last war pushed this graveyard out to the street. He used to laugh, down there, the rain never chills your bones. Then hoist his ladder, 2 eyes of stucco, Patch them pronto, those eyes bleeding in the rain. Windshield wipers erase his face each time he laughs or cries or says what's so special about the dead he betrayed her. So this next to last section is called Home, and it's not like it's not meant to resonate with Gaspar Bachelet's The Poetics of Space in a positive, enculturative way. It's meant to be a word with scare quotes around it. So we moved into an all-white neighborhood in 1962, and a well-to-do neighborhood in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And being the oldest of four, one tends to watch one's parents, very, very closely. I mean, you're kind of there as they're making themselves into who they will be later on, and it's something that your brothers and sisters don't always see, especially if they come along, 6, 7, 10 years later. And what I saw was not the promise, the possibilities, or the kind of trajectory of a better life that comes from being in a bigger home in an all-white community. What I saw was a real sense of depression and what is euphemistically referred to as code switching. And so it was a life of living in two different ways and always feeling the pressure of one's neighbors in the way that one would feel the pressure of the police somewhere else, but not being able to call them the police. My parents were, as I said before, not radical, but something snapped as, when King was assassinated, as happened with most black people around the country. And I saw a side of myself, a side of my mother in 1968 that I hadn't seen for, that was just kind of the opposite of what I'd seen 6 years before that, from 62 to 68, a certain kind of assumption of antagonism and militancy that I had, that she had always taught me was wrong and not the way to move through this new world. This poem is called Civil Rights. Mother never spoke of slavery. She was born and raised in a debutante ball. But when they killed King, she wrote every blue hair, blonde eye letter. Like any spring of no reply, winter was late in leaving, and we were her only postage, my sister and I, walking end to end through the seep of slush and the push of wind. No one dabbed a crystal eye, for she would have no crying. The next one is called Meant for the Neighbors. And I remember, we had, needless to say, we did not have, we're good friends now. I'm 60, and they're like 84, 85. But needless to say, for those years coming up, she was always wondering, well, I would love to have someone else take you off my hands, So I was always pushing against what they were trying to do, and I asked my dad about this because we had been to Berkeley on a sabbatical in 1970, and after that all bets were off. The Panthers had this after-school imperialist class that you could go to. You could just walk from Willard Junior High School down to it, and you could have everything but a gun. To have a gun, and I was 14, you see. But to do the weapons training, you had to get permission from your parents, you know, and I was never able to forge their signature in a way that convinced them, you know. You know. So, you know, when the other kids got to do the real deal, you know, I was in the political education class, I had to like trottle off home, you know. Needless to say, I was a bit of an oddity to them, and this poem actually takes place a couple years before them, when I was about 11 or 12, as we're getting ready to go. But it doesn't matter when it takes place. It's the zeitgeist follows us through. But the thing is that a few years ago, I said to them, you know, why, when the revolution came, were you so, you know, hard on me? And I thought that we were going to get into one of our normal ideological battles, you know. And an interesting thing happened. My dad said, I was just afraid you were going to get killed. And I was like, oh, you know, I don't know what it did. It just made me see them and him differently. Still being heard in the back? Okay. Meant for the neighbors. I survived childhood on quotations from film stars and Chairman Mao. A monk with malachite beads, I clenched the words of others. But of my graceless lurch through white grammar schools, was it Stevenson or Poe? I pledged to memory and took to my mother. Before a man dies, he must write a book, love a woman, and kill a man. She eyed me as though I was a parcel intended for the neighbors. You mean, what does it mean? No. I mean, is it true? We were alone. The window was open, and the drapes were still refusing to explain why she was looking away. The last one in this section is one of those poems that, you know, you write and then you put away because it's so hard to look at yourself through this poem, to look at your family through this poem. But I think that, you know, not enough work has been done on the negative hydraulics of integration as it affects a black family. There's, you know, so much work has been done on what's so good about getting people out of the ghetto into the white schools. Well, sorry, there were words there. So. But so this poem is called Chronicle, and it's divided into sections. And 2, which means me at 2 years old. When we were just coming from the place where my mother's people near Mississippi, her extended family. And then 6, when we were finally in Minneapolis. And then 8, still in Minneapolis, and 12. So 2 years old, 6 years old, 8 years old, and 12 years old. 2. They smile, tip their hats, lower their shotguns, and let us cross the Mississippi line. Legs dangling from the pickup in front, I don't recall. The guns Mom remembers, Dad doing the nothing he could do. Up north, he'll make a career of it. 6. For Halloween, I washed my face and wore my school clothes, went door to door as a nightmare. 8. At night, Dad builds a fire, feeds it with my clippings, Castro on parade. Why does my penis stick out more than most? He stares at the rug where embers fall. Lose some weight, it'll go back in. Flags, nations, armies, lots of people get aroused. 12. My sister is 6, and we don't like her. Too cute, too seldom beaten. We're glad her hair's a nappy nigger mess. Mom hides it with a wig. We snatch that wig right off. She rolls in the dirt, holding her head. we stand above her, satisfied as stormtroopers. So the last section, and then we can chat. Or not. I remember when we spent a year in Germany, and a colleague at UC Davis asked me about, my time at the Goethe Institute studying German. And my wife Anita had gotten sick. Her knee had meniscus problems, and what happened was that we just had to do a lot of speaking German in the real world, using that language. So I got pretty good at it, and I surprised myself in how good I got at it. I could go shopping, I could ask directions, I could talk to doctors, And I was telling this colleague that I said, but the one thing I couldn't do with the Germans is I couldn't talk about my dreams, And she said, that's okay, Frank. I doubt they'd want to know what. Okay, so this section is called, as I said before, so that was to say that if you don't want to talk with me about my dreams, that's perfectly understandable. This is called Death or People Without Personhood. So the first poem in this section is called The Convocation of Conquest, and as many people know, that's a line that I stole from Amy Cesaire's notebook of a return to my to the native land. In the poem, it's a very long poem. It was highly influential to me as a young person, because I used to think that instead of making sense, I had to make metaphor, and what I couldn't get over the hump is that Amy Cesaire did both, And talk about hubris at low places. It never occurred to me that I was like 18 years old and untutored, and he was this like literary genius, and maybe that's why I hadn't gotten to where he was. Okay, but in that poem he writes, no race has a monopoly on beauty or intelligence or strength, and there is room for everyone at the Convocation of Conquest. And unfortunately, I've come to theorize that that's probably not true. And so what struck me is the way in which we had a workshop with young people from Skyline High School and some grad students, and we were dealing with Afro-pessimism earlier. And one of the things that I don't think the American public in particular and the world in general could actually accept is that the violence against black people is a regime of violence for which there is no analogy. And I'll give you a short example. When people talk about sexual violation, the concept of sexual violation is just far too puny to actually begin to theorize and conceptualize what has happened to black people over the centuries. The historians get it in terms of how they record it, but in my view, they don't always know what to make of it. And there's a book out, for example, called The American Slave Coast that just came out in January, and it will just blow your mind. I mean, it talks about how within perhaps a generation, not more than a generation and a half, the South bred black people like cattle, which we all know, but the horrific details of it make it such that you actually cannot begin to think about the concept of sexual violation and actually begin to explain how you have 389,000 black people in the South, and then within several decades are bred into 4 million people. I mean, the regime of violence needed to force 389,000 people into 4 million is beyond the imagination. And that was necessary so that, for, among other things, Virginia, which was a slave breeding state, could get the upper hand on South Carolina, which was a slave importing state. And if you remember the Constitution, the more slaves you have, the more votes you have in the Electoral College. So black people are not subjects of consent, we're objects of political machinations and machines. And this means, well, what it means, I can't even begin to think about. So I took Césaire's The Convocation of Conquest and thought it without the sense of redemption that comes through in that poem, even though I love his work, The Convocation of Conquest. My chair was missing from the table, an oversight, I'm sure. Standing there, I considered the distance we'd walked just to arrive, and the horses apathetic to the prey of their riders, gaining in spite of themselves, with heads so enormous, cold mist from their nostrils fell upon the moon, upon you and me, and the men and women we took with us from the corners of sleep. One dream, one table, one people with one unnameable loss, and no place set, even aside. I'll close with a poem that I've read, maybe you've heard, I've read it at Kiombo and in Oakland and in Omni Commons. It's a poem for the Bay because it was sparked by the death of the murder, assassination of Oscar Grant and the resistance that flowed into the street after that. It's called Law Abiding. Don't slant the story to fit your needs. Bullets been catching hell from niggers long as I've been born. Like apples, okay, you got your few bad bullets, but most work hard and vote. Yes, they vote, and got wives and sweet kids in the clip. Who cradles them when a nigger vamps? Who says what to them? Mrs. Bullet, I have some bad news for you. Then what? It's about your husband, Mr. John Frederick Bullitt. Or, may I call you Frida? Frida, John Frederick passed this evening. Now Frida, be strong, for unsavory are the details. He died in a nigger's spine. Crushed on impact. Now Frida, don't cry. The DA is on it, the judge has been briefed, and your husband's friends are in the streets. Thank you. So I think we have a little time.
You definitely have time.
Okay, cool. Actually said, no one will want to talk to you about your feelings. Any comments? Those have been questions.
I'll kick us off.
Good.
So the 4 sections of the chapbook are not in chronological order of your experience.
Definitely not.
Right. So I wondered if you could tell us why you sequenced them the way that you did.
I was running out of time. Well, yeah, no, that's a good question. I actually think, I think that there's a way in which my South African experience, you know, what I've been thinking about critically in terms of as I said, I studied rhetoric here, in terms of the structure of narrative has within it a kind of, the ontology has within it this redemption. What I mean by that is a kind of closure. And that there are basically two types. One could be a redemptive closure at the level of morality, which is to say that the causal principle of a poem or a story is bound up in psychology and psychological motivations and how people relate to each other, and the questions that is kind of tied up, if not resolved for the personas, but resolved for the reader, is the question of whether or not interpersonal relations are possible and how they are possible. And so a story redeems the sense of possibility. And I really thought that, and before I go to the next point, the other one would be a historical materialist narrative, which says, no, the causal principle of narratives are institutional forces, as opposed to interpersonal psychological motivations and dimensions. And the redemption, real or imagined, is in what happens to a social formation that is oppressed. So Turtle Island is returned to the Native American, whether that happens or not. We move into a communist dispensation from capitalism. And I've really, South Africa shook me to the moorings, because I realized that the world is not going to allow Black people to have a redemptive narrative. In fact, as I'm theorizing it now, narrative itself is necessarily anti-Black, because the slave position does not allow for storying. Storying is a prerogative of the master. So South Africa was the kind of political and historical materialist redemptive hope for so many people, and it still is in a way. So I started there, right? And love, of course, is a personal, interpersonal form of redemption, and so those two strategies for redeeming narrative progression are at the beginning. And at the end, what you have is what Jared Sexton, who I work with at UC Irvine, calls the concrete reality of Black people, which is, he says, the concrete reality of Black people is something that no one can address. And the only way that people in the world, talking particularly on the left, address it is by making the concrete reality of Black people metaphoric, so that it becomes a tool for them to think about their own oppression. And so what I wanted to do is to end with the concrete reality of Black people, and something that is absent, that is absentine, the concept of redemption. Oh, sorry.
No,
Thank you very much.
Down here, thank you. Thank you. So I guess my question is about, the will to create. As you straddle these worlds of both being very prolific, academic, and it's very like you just gestured towards how storying is anti-Black. And so I'm interested in how your work and your presence as a creative writer, what that does for you, both personally and academically.
That is the $64,000 question. Woo! I feel like Woody Allen at the end of Husbands and Wives. I said, "Can I go now?" Yeah. I mean, I'm nervous. The question makes me nervous, and I'm celebrating your question because it gets right to the core. I don't know. And I remember. And I'll answer anecdotally, and then I'll try to answer it directly as I calm myself and correct myself. I'm reminded of when me and Jared were sitting down, and when we were in grad school here at Berkeley, and we were under the tutelage of a Black feminist theorist, Cynthia Hartman, the word Afro-pessimism comes from this building. This is where her office was, and she gave us that word, right? And she had warned us to mask these things as allegories of the past, because no one could actually think about the slave reality of black people as being something of the 20th century. You know? And that's how you get under the wire, you know, talking to whites and non-blacks by saying, oh, this is a thing of the past, and things have changed. So we're like, no, we gotta go for it, no. You know, and we didn't have the actual, or I didn't. I mean, Jared had more of a theoretical apparatus than I did, but we didn't have the complete apparatus to deal with a hostile crowd that is not going to accept that slavery is the necessary condition of existence in the United States and the world. You know? And so someone said to Jared, well, it sounds to me, there's some, people raise their hand. Well, I got a question. What really mean is I'm working differently on this. And under the pretext of a question, I'm going to tell you what my project is. Why your shit ain't shit. And he rarely jumps out of the bag, right? I'm the one who jumps out of the bag, And so what they said, but they attacked him, they said, it sounds to me like what you're saying is black people have no reason to get up in the morning, And he said, no, I didn't say that. What I said is we have no good reason to get up in the morning. Look, that's true. I mean, we're harassed at every level of abstraction, in every arena. And the only thing I have a sister who was in the Muslims and not the nation, but I can't remember. This is a long time ago. We used to argue. I was a Marxist, and she prayed Allah, and I thought that was absolutely different in this. And we would argue about who was right and who was wrong. But ultimately, what the reality was is that the structure was not, and it's in Malcolm X. It hasn't been, it's nothing new. The structure was not oppressing me because of my communist views, or oppressing her because of Islam. Right? It was oppressing us because we were black. And that's a really hard thing to deal with, especially when you're in these writers' workshops with other people, like people of color, who are making two moves in their literature, right? One is the move of describing the oppression, and the other is the move, as I said before, of redemption. And you're being pressured into doing that. The only way that I can keep going, because that's where the question that put me back on my heels was, is by reminding myself that this thing starts 1,300 years ago. If you look at the Arab literature as they begin to enslave the east coast of Africa, so that the world begins to build a consensus that black people are socially dead and that Africa is a carceral continuum. And it passes that consensus. That's what civil society is, an anti-black consensus. And it passes that on to the Europeans. And so it feels like a divine thing that has just come down on us in a supernatural way. My only thing is in studying history is that it's a paradigm where humanness is paradigmatically coherent in its anti-blackness. But it is also constructed. And so as a revolutionary, I have to keep thinking that the little bit I do, these poems, whatever I write, the activism, that somehow will come to page 100 of Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask and bring it into the world. And that's it. But how does that happen? Because there's nothing, if blackness stands in contradistinction to humanness, if humanness becomes knowledgeable, if I am alive because I am that black, then to think of a political project that would redeem blackness is conceptually, it's like an epistemologically impossible thing. The project is to destroy humanness. And I fundamentally believe that humanness is constructed, even though it feels divine. And that's perhaps the only way that I could keep going. Is that getting close to the end?
Thank you.
Difficult. Emotionally difficult. Yes, I know there was Anne somewhere else.
I have a quick question. You mentioned earlier, sort of trying to conscript your students to help you root out affirmation in your writings. And I was wondering, what's the ethical or aesthetic imperative against, why no affirmation?
Well, I didn't mean like go outside and don't say I like flowers, you know. What I meant by it gets back into it really kind of loops back into Jeffrey's question about redemption. I kind of, they're not exactly interchangeable, but Marx affirms the possibility of a new world, and it's epistemologically coherent. So he writes it out as, you know, the end of the wage relation, right? The destruction of the ruling class and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Okay, that is a political affirmation. Okay. Hollywood affirms the capacity for interpersonal redemption. That's, you know, which is to say, love conquers all in the end. Right? And what Afro-pessimism says is that if you're black, love has already been conquered by violence. So that, but it doesn't say, so therefore jump off a bridge or something like that. But what it does say is it goes back to Fanon's, you know, Fanon is having a hard time in Black Skin, White Mask. That's why the book is so impressionistic. Because he starts the book trying to figure out how he and his white wife can have a relationship. So he's trying to affirm the possibility of moving through psychoanalysis so that he can move through psychoanalysis to help himself overcome the neurotic complex of hallucinatory whitening. And then she can, through psychoanalysis, overcome the neurotic complex of white superiority. And what he finds in that book, and this is why he can't, part of the reason why he can't write it as clearly as The Wretched of the Earth, is because what he finds is that works as long as they don't leave the room. As long as they don't leave the room. So he doesn't know what to do with that, and neither do I. And this is why I say, you know, write yourself into a cul-de-sac in your dissertation, because there's the hydraulics of resolving the problems that you raise is precisely the kind of trajectory that will make your work useless to revolutionary activity. The problems that you raise will be solved in the streets. You don't need to solve them in your book. One or two last ones? Yes?
This is a somewhat theoretical question. It's a tremendous honor to listen to your reading and to hear about your life. I've read some of your work before, and I was just curious why you seem to have spoken about the idea of humanness as constructed rather than divine. Yet in a lot of your work, you use the word ontology, the ontology of blackness. And I'm just curious what led you to that choice of describing something as being rather than, you referred to Deleuze earlier, than becoming, or than epistemology, than knowledge.
Well, Jared has said that when you read my book, you should put the word political in front of ontology. And so, because I'm not a pure philosopher, you know, I'm not thinking ontology, you know, is pure being. But what I am saying is that if you look at every political discourse, there's a metaphysics of being of the discourse. And there are basically three components. One is the coherence of temporality, so that the discourse assumes that one can labor on endless duration to produce event. And then there is the coherence of spatiality, so that one can labor on vast space to produce cartography. So those two things are there. And because every political discourse has to have a kind of spatial and or temporal coherence that recognizes the capacity for event making and or map making, cartography. And that is precisely the thing that doesn't, that is the ontological resistance. You know, in other words, if I recognize your space-time constructions, that doesn't mean I accept them. Because there are three space-time constructions that have been recognized right where we're standing, right? The United States, Mexico, and Turtle Island. Okay, right here. Two of them have been conquered through genocide and imperialism, but the conquering of them doesn't absent their coherence. There is no such thing as a time-space coherence from Black life that can be recognized by others. The only thing that Blacks are allowed to do is become either refugees in other people's political projects or agents. I don't mean active agents. I should say widgets of other people's hegemonic projects. And Barack Obama, for example, he's not a creator of hegemony. He is a tool of hegemony, which is very different than Bill Clinton or George Bush. You know, right? He's not an interlocutor. So what I'm suggesting is that when Fanon says the Black has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white, what he's saying is that the Black imagination of space and time is not received as being legitimate or extant. It's the only thing the Black can do is elaborate on or participate in the space-time constructions of others. And that's absolutely necessary for those other space-time constructions to have coherence, which is precisely why Black people live underneath a regime of violence which is gratuitous. I mean, violence against Black people is not discriminatory. It's necessary. It keeps repeating itself and repeating itself so that others can then have a sense of being when everything else goes wrong. Why? Because I don't receive violence without a transgression. Okay, and so it's really about political ontology, the ontology of the political imagination. And I said in the book over here, which is selling for $27, that as antagonistic as indigenous theory is, and what Churchill has written on this, you know, why Marxism doesn't work for Indians, right? As conflictual as the content of, say, Marxism is with the content of indigenism, and that's in the middle of like 80 pages of that book, they share the homologies of political ontology. They share the characteristics of recognizing each other's time-space constructions, labors, and no one allows that of Black people. Was that,
Yeah.
okay, was there one more in the lead?
Then we'll end without redemption. Thank you so much. Please come look at this book selling for only $27.